Good morning. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the co-pastors here at Watershed. I don't know what you were doing 23 years ago today. Some of you weren't even born 23 years ago today. But I know what I was doing. I was doing this 23 years ago today. And so, yeah, you can applaud. It's our anniversary. 23 years ago today, I pledged my devotion to Donna, my wife, and she was the one, right? The person who was going to help me or help us live happily ever after. And you might be asking, well, why aren't you at the beach? Why aren't you at the mountains? And it's because when Donna and I sat down, we decided there is no other place on the world that we would rather be than here with you. You're that special. Actually, we just moved into a house, and we have nothing but boxes. That's why we're still here this weekend. So it has nothing to do with you. Sorry if I just popped your bubble, burst your bubble a little bit. But I thought that might be interesting to mention this morning, given this is the last weekend of a series where we've been talking about life, with people and relationships and marriage and dating and sex and divorce and all kinds of stuff, right? Here's how I want to get into this morning's conversation, though. There's a passage in Matthew's gospel where he describes Jesus and Peter having a sidebar conversation. Matthew says it went something like this. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that we must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day to be raised to life. Well, let me push pause for just a second. First of all, Peter, as well as all the disciples that were following Jesus, had this really myopic, romantic idea for what it meant to be connected to Jesus, to be in relationship with him. Namely, in their eyes, Jesus was the Messiah that Israel was waiting for to swoop down, to rise up, so to speak, and begin to vanquish the oppressors of Israel, namely Rome. And so they saw this happening through some sort of violent exchange. And this was going to usher in a new era of Israel where she would be returned to a place of prominence and power, military power, political power. In fact, later on in the Gospels, right after the Last Supper that Jesus has with his friends, his disciples, Peter being one of them, begin to argue about who is the greatest among them that could take the seat at the right of Jesus once all of this unfolds. And the thing is that Jesus never gives us any energy. He never reinforces this narrative, never fuels this way of thinking, never mentions revolts or uprisings or violence. In fact, he goes out of his way to insist that the kingdom that he's describing, that he thinks God is ushering in, is the antithesis of this sort of thing. That this kingdom that he's describing isn't about killing your enemies, but it's actually about loving your enemies. It's about forgiving your enemies. It's about rehabilitating your enemies or creating some sort of reconciliation between you and your enemies. And it's about this peaceful, passionate, subversive resistance towards those systems, political or religious, that tend to be oppressive or create cycles of destruction, not just to Israel, but to anyone. And so this is the sort of movement, this is the sort of world, should it start to emerge, that Jesus says is worth going and dying for, but it's not worth killing for. And so when Peter hears Jesus say these sorts of things, it's like he puts him in a timeout. He says, wait, come here, we need to talk. Excuse us. And he takes him aside and he rebukes Jesus. Never, Lord, he says, this shall never happen to you. In other words, you can't die. That's not a part of the script that we have envisioned for the collective us. I just need to remind you of this, that everything depends on you being who we think you need to be. And if you die, none of that happens. And Jesus wheels around and he calls Peter a Satan, an accuser, a stumbling block. And he says, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. There's a lot going on in this passage. There's a lot politically, there's a lot theologically and spiritually, but there's also something pretty interesting going on relationally. Um, in this moment, we watch Peter, in his view of his relationship with Jesus, move from what I would call enchantment to disenchantment. It's this moment when his idealistic, self-serving view of Jesus starts to be dismantled. So much of how we move in and through the pursuit of another person, so much of how we move through dating and engagement and marriage or unions of any longevity has something to do with a narrative that goes something like this. I have this inner gap in myself. I need this other person, this other experience or thing to somehow fill this gap. And once I have this person, experience, or thing, then I'll be whole, then I'll be complete, then I'll be happy, then I'll be healed, then I can live happily ever after. And so that's the enchanted narrative. And I think probably there's several of us here today who might think or might say, that might be true for some people, but I don't think that's true for me. I don't think that's true in the way that I view my reality with other relationships, whether that's dating or marriage. But I would say that it's almost impossible to exempt yourself from that narrative at some level. It's constantly reinforced in culture, in entertainment, in consumerism, through media. Not to mention, we are woefully addicted to our emotional self. We have a really hard time understanding or grabbing hold of being a human being that is having an emotional experience instead of our feelings being the sum total of who we are in our identity. We have a really hard time separating those two. We typically, what happens is when we feel this enchanted narrative take on some sort of threat, the feelings that start to surface cause us to try to grab hold and white knuckle that relationship or that narrative and do everything we can to control it. And sometimes controlling means amping up certain things. So sometimes we'll amp up expectation. Like we'll raise the bar for the other person. And we'll say either you have to either return to who you were, or you have to become somebody different, because who you were that I used to appreciate, I no longer appreciate. So, what starts out as, oh, she was so carefree and so spontaneous. I just love that about her. Moves to, oh my gosh, it's like herding cats. Right? Like I can't balance a budget. She's so undisciplined. Or maybe it's, he's so quiet. He's so mysterious. I just love that about him. And then 5 years later, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't get a word out of him. Like, do you have an emotional thought? You see how this can shift. And of course, we need to edit ourselves, and we need to make sure that we're communicating what makes us happy, what brings us joy. But what we're saying when we start to create this external pressure and amp up the expectation is it's about performance. If we're not careful, it's you're not enough. You're not going to be enough until you behave, think, or feel a certain way. And this is really begins to, at one level, dehumanize this other person. They become an object that we're trying to control to create some sort of clarity internally for ourselves. Sometimes we amp up the expectation. Sometimes we amp up distraction. Let's just start taking on stuff. Let's buy stuff. Let's do stuff. Let's have another child. Let's stare into our phones. Let's bury ourselves in our work, our golf, our kids. Maybe it's more toxic, addictive type things, gambling, drugs, pornography, or whatever. But amping up is really about numbing. It's about creating some sort of white noise that allows us to just pretend the enchanting narrative is not falling apart. Let's just keep the perception alive. And what happens is at some point that just doesn't work. Amping up expectation doesn't work in the long run, and neither does distraction. At some point the relationship ends, or it transitions into some sort of experience where you wake up 20 years later and it's just been tolerable at best. And here's the thing, disillusionment is going to happen in long-term relationships, right? Like you're going to have seasons or circumstances where you're disenchanted. It's at one level with another person, but that's not even what I'm talking about here. The disenchantment that I'm talking about is the practice of letting go of the belief in the enchanted narrative itself and considering something more significant. I'm doing a wedding in a few weekends. I do those every now and then. And one of the passages that often is requested to be included in a wedding is 1 Corinthians 13. Paul's beautiful poetic rant about love. You've probably heard this if you've been, I'm glad you think that's funny. This beautiful rant about love. It's a good rant. But love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It's not proud. It doesn't keep record of wrongdoing. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because the next wedding you'll be able to read it yourself or hear it. But it's this poetic summary for Paul about the sort of love he believes is possible in the world that Jesus had envisioned. And in a wedding, usually it's a real moment. Like hopefully it's a real moment. In my weddings, I try to make a real moment out of it. But right after this moment, this montage about love, it's like Paul he flips a different switch. He changes gears and he writes, or he says this rather. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, when I grew up, I set aside childish ways. Now we see but a dim reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And I love the paradox that he creates in this. It's as though he begins with, this is so beautiful, this is so hopeful, this is so enchanting. But then he says, but to live trapped in that type of naivete at some point will not serve you well. When it comes to how you love someone, at some point you have to grow into something where maturity looks different. And oddly enough, in his economy, Paul's economy, maturity doesn't appear to be the place where the questions get answered or where certainty or stability become the ground upon which you stand. Instead, he says, we see the world and we see each other, not with clarity, but like a reflection in a poorly lit room with a really poorly lit mirror. And he's convinced that at some point, humanity, or maybe even he and his friends will see each other with well-lit faces, that they'll be fully known to themselves as they are to each other. But until then, he says we're limited. Our ability to see remains dwarfed. Peter Rollins, in a book called The Divine Magician, commenting on this passage, writes this: to be truly known by someone is also to be known as unknown. For someone to really know us, they must not simply hold positive facts about us, but also grasp the unfathomable abyss of our subjectivity and our singularity. A relationship that's only seen as a void filler, as enchanted, can only make room for positive facts about another person, because in the enchanted version, you're always measuring whether this person's objective qualities work to fill the missing gap so that either or one of you can live happily ever after. And what Paul and what Rollins are saying, though, is that type of knowledge is self-limiting. Rollins continues on in his line of thought by saying, to know someone means embracing the other's inherent resistance to being fully known. I had the same reaction. Yeah. Like there's not just the things that I can't see or don't know how to get to in myself, but then there's a person across the table who is resisting that in ways that it's probably easier for me to see. Just like, if we're really honest, it's easier for them to see my resistance as well. He goes on to write, to know someone is to know that person as an abyss, as an ever-changing and internally divided subject, which is another way of saying that we acknowledge the unconscious in the other. Enchantment, I think, is about holding on to things that we think are objective, and the objective thing that we're holding on to can somehow do for us so that we can fill in the blank. We have all kinds of things we want to put in those answer blanks, right? Disenchantment is about, though, recognizing then we are so much more than fill in the blank people. That there's so much more to see beyond the observable. Enchantment is about a narrative that makes no room for our humanity or suffering and the depths of experiences that actually shape us in ways that we have yet to discover. But disenchantment, the process or maybe even the practice, if allowed to do its work, presses us. It pushes in on us to become more open, more humble, more realistic to who we are not, and the drives behind the why of why we treat each other or ourselves the way we do. And so it may appear often, it will appear often as a dim reflection in a mirror. But over time, we begin to see each other differently. We see each other face to face. That's another way of saying really seeing each other. And we begin to know in part and then begin to know more fully, even as we are known more fully. And so, 23 years in, man, that's something to be excited about. And I thought maybe having trekked a couple of decades and then some with Donna, maybe there could be a few questions that if you were interested in letting go of the enchantment narrative and really grabbing hold of the disenchanting narrative, what were some questions maybe that would be helpful? And here's a few. Here's the first one. If you had to gauge the engine that drives your need for another person or the relationship you're currently in, how much of that engine is fueled by enchantment? About this subversive narrative that says that I need this other person so that I have some sense of being complete or whole. Have you ever felt a relationship begin leaning into disenchantment? And if so, what sort of reaction or response did you employ? Was this reaction or response about amping up the expectation? About white-knuckling what was happening? Was it about amping up distraction, creating white noise? And then finally, in the process of dating, engaging, or marrying, how do you cultivate a type of knowing that's more than just about positive or objective facts about a person? And how do you do that with yourself? Like if you're moving towards a relationship or thinking about it someday, like how do you begin to cultivate that type of soil in your own life? And then finally, we're ending this morning by celebrating the Eucharist together. That's probably already apparent. For thousands of years, Christians have believed, they've gathered together and believed that in some mysterious fashion, that Christ's body being broken and his blood being spilled out, somehow God is healing the world in all of that. And so when we gather together and we break bread this way, part of what we're saying is that we long for this type of healing ourselves. We long for it to happen in us and happen through us. And actually moving through this together, we're participating in the healing of the world the way that God is healing in this day and age. And so a couple of things worth mentioning. Maybe you notice that this is more than a few wafers and a couple of glasses of juice. Like this is a full-blown meal. And part of that is because 2,000 years ago, it wasn't just a wafer and a cup of juice, right? Like Jesus and his disciples were around a table and there was volume and they were talking and it was good food and it was good drink. And so in some ways, we're in line with the actual tradition. In some ways we're not, because his disciples didn't make a Costco run on Wednesday to make it happen, but it's another story. But for 13 years we've been doing it this way. We practice the Eucharist every quarter, and the one right before Easter, for whatever reason, we feel like we need to mark that one. And so that's why this is the way it is today. And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to come and partake. And I've been asked to really reinforce the idea that we have a ton of food, so don't be shy. Like, this is a meal. This isn't a snack. So, like, eat. Like, belly up, whatever it is that you need to hear in all of that. And then second, we call this experience the open table because the invitation to participate is for everyone and anyone, religious or irreligious. When Jesus sat down with Judas, he already knew the premeditated decisions and actions that Judas was going to take, and he refused to exempt him from the meal. In fact, he said, no, there's room for even my enemy today. And so I don't know what you walk in here with, disbelief, belief, woundedness, grief, anger, bitterness, whatever it is, you are welcome. There's a spot for you, and we hope that you'll take advantage of it. It would be our honor to meet you at this table this morning in that regard. And then lastly, we've never wrapped up this series with this. Never in 13 years. So this is a new thing, and we're thinking that maybe this could be a helpful thing, because some of what we've talked about over the last 6 weeks, I know for some of you it's been really hard. And I know there's some of you in this room today where it's just really hard, period, right now. And so maybe part of standing up and moving towards the meal is giving yourself permission to be exactly where you are right now, whether that's in a place of grief or that's in a place of pain. Maybe today is about giving yourself permission to trust that this isn't about you performing for God, but actually God saying, I'm going to meet you in the blood, in the soil, in the angst of where you are today. And could you begin to trust that God loves you, whether you feel loved or not? Can you do that? And then finally, for those of us who have spent years practicing believing that that's actually true, can we celebrate today? Can we look around the room and be reminded that we get to do this together, that we get to stand in solidarity with one another in a world that's broken and fractured and longing for this sort of grace in its own realms, in its own life. And so I'm gonna read the passage from Mark that describes this moment. I'm gonna pray, and then I'm gonna invite you to come down the aisles and take both sides of the table and just really immerse yourself this morning. It says in Mark 14 that while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. I prefer to translate this to his friends, the people he did life with, saying, take it, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many, not just a few, for many. And he said to them, do this in remembrance of me. God, this morning, we express gratitude for the grace that we feel in our lives. We're thankful that we even have a meal that we can share together. There are parts of this world where that's not even possible. So we don't take this moment for granted. We also don't take for granted, God, that there's something powerful about a community of people who's willing to sit in the muck of the difficulty and in the vibrancy of the joy. And may we love well each other. May we embrace your love. And may we find wholeness, forgiveness, and life in this meal together today. We love you. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.